dying alone. Having already worked a double shift at the hospital, I was asked by the director of nursing if I would continue working the night shift until a registered nurse could be located to take over the charge of Medical 3 ward. I was very tired, but I agreed to continue until someone could be found to replace me. There were many duties an LPN was not allowed to perform, such as dispensing certain medications, and the rules required in case of an emergency that an RN or a trained physician be present on the ward at all times. But that didn't seem to matter. I was sitting behind the desk when I noticed a dome light come on outside room 320. Taking a fast sip of coffee, I headed down the hallway to see what Mrs. Calaveras might need. As I entered the private room, her daughter came walking toward me with her finger pressed against her lips, letting me know to remain quiet. "I have to go get something to eat. Would you stay with my mother until I return?" Shaking my head, I nodded yes. Mrs. Calaveras was in her upper 80s and was not expected to live through the night. Her daughter had told me earlier that her mother as a child had been raised in an orphanage and was severely abused, just as I had been in an orphanage, and that she had an unbelievable fear of having to die without someone by her side. The little girl living deep down inside her mother still cried to be loved and hopefully would not be forgotten. That was a fear that I knew very well, and I had thought about many times when I battled cancer. I stood by her bedside and I wiped her forehead as she perspired profusely. "Eloise, Rousey, are you there?" she would bellow out in a faint and shaking voice. "They're right here, Miss Calaveras," I would tell her. Eloise and Rousey were her two sisters, both now deceased, and they themselves had been raised in the orphanage also. "Mr. Kiser!" a voice shouted from out in the hallway. I reached over and turned on the light to room 320. Several seconds later, the director of nursing entered the room. "Why are you not at the station?" she replied in a harsh voice. Mrs. Calaveras' daughter went out to get something to eat, and she asked me if I'd stay with Mrs. Calaveras for just a few minutes." "Your responsibility is to charge the desk, not sit and pamper the patients." "I have the door open, and I can hear any dome lights that come on, ma'am," I replied. Pointing at me, she snapped her finger quickly toward the doorway, telling me to immediately make my way back to the nursing desk. "I'm sorry, but I can't leave Miss Calaveras until her daughter returns." Giving me a very stern look, she turned and walked out the door, closing it behind her. Bing, 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 began to sound the various patient lights as they began to light up. I knew there was no emergency, that the director of nurses was deliberately turning on the lights to force me out of the room. "Eloise, Rosie, are you there?" sounded Mrs. Calaveras again. "Mr. Kiser, you have other patients to attend to," sounded the nurse, again in a very harsh and evil tone. "Eloise, Rousey, are you there?" "Mr. Kiser!" "Eloise, Rousey, are you there?" "Mr. Kiser!" Letting go of Mrs. Calaveras' hand, I walked over and opened the door. I turned around and looked at Mrs. Calaveras. "Eloise, Rousey, are you there?" she cried out again. "Kiser, you get your behind out here, and I mean right this minute!" yelled the director of nurse. Slowly I closed the door and I walked back over to the bedside. I picked up the rag and once again I began to wipe her forehead. Several minutes later, the director of nursing and the replacement RN came walking into the room. The director walked over, grabbed me by the arm, and gave me a very stern look. I looked up as Mrs. Calaveras' daughter entered the room and walked over to her mother's bedside and took her hand. It was at that very moment that the heart monitor discontinued beeping and the tone became constant. All hell broke loose in the room. The director declared a code red situation. That was the very first difficult situation for me to be in at such a young age, having to make a choice between what was right, wrong, correct, or moral. Was I supposed to make a choice for what was best for me, the hospital, Mrs. Calaveras, or the other patients? I will forever remember my mind racing 90 miles per hour in a never-ending circle of confusion. I really don't remember making a choice that day. I do remember thinking that I had given the hospital that particular day more than was required of me as an employee. Had another patient been in danger, I certainly would have left Mrs. Calaveras' bedside. Never having had a mother or a father, and never wanting anyone to die alone, I guess the orphan factor just became my overriding concern.